certified by the storytelling manual when it has passed. The speech title is Colorado to South Dakota in 1883. In November of 1882, William Soper of Colorado City, Colorado, died in Fort Collins while visiting his daughter. The following spring, his widow, Susan Soper, and her 3 children traveled by covered wagon to South Dakota in search of a place to homestead. This is the story of that trip. Kerry.
The Dakota and Wyoming territories were still the Wild West in 1883. It had been just a few years since Custer made his last stand to go to Bighorn. It had been just a few years since Wild Bill Hickok was shot down in a saloon in Deadwood. In eastern South Dakota, L. Frank Baum, the eventual author of The Wizard of Oz, was writing scathing editorials calling for the extermination of all Indians. Cattlemen and farmers were becoming increasingly in conflict because the cattlemen were used to having their cattle roam the free range, and the farmers were fencing off large portions of that. In short, it was the Wild West. Oh, those masters. A few years ago, on a trip back to South Dakota, I had the good fortune to meet a cousin of my grandmother's. And her grandmother had been Mary Soper, who had kept a diary during that trip from Colorado to South Dakota, and I was fortunate enough to get a copy of that. And this is the highlights of the trip to South Dakota. They started off, there was a trail from Cheyenne to the Black Hills during that time because there was, gold mining was at its peak. And so there were freight trails where wagons to carry gold back and forth from the mines to the city. And so there were some roads. Roads in 1883 are an entirely different concept than what we call roads now, and they were very rough. The family left Fort Collins on July 16, 1883. It had been just 6 months, or it had been just a year since they lost their youngest daughter in Colorado City who died. And then 8 months before they left, their father had died. So this party decided, for whatever reason, that they were going to go to South Dakota and find a place to live. The party consisted of Mary Soper, who was 23 years old at the time. Her mother, Susan, was in her 40s. She had a younger brother, Waldo, who was 23, and the youngest girl, Adeline, who was my great-grandmother, was 14 at the time. Plan was they would go to Cheyenne and meet up with their other daughter, Adeline, who had a husband and a 2-month-old baby, and then they were going to set off and head out to South Dakota and cover the wagon. Well, as they left and were going across the country, this is very rugged country, a lot of hills, a lot of plains, but very little water. It's very dry in that part of the country, especially in the summertime. When it rains, there would be huge gushers and huge gullies that made crossing them difficult. But the rest of the time, there was very little water. So they would go a long period of times, and when they did find water, often it was alkali water that was so bad that it wasn't good for much of anything except breeding mosquitoes. And it was really good at breeding mosquitoes. So they were constantly under attack by mosquitoes, and they had to stay up at night and fight mosquitoes to keep the horses out of the water because they didn't want them to drink this bad water because it caused them to slow down their journey. So off they went, and the first 43 miles to Cheyenne took them about 3 days. And when they reached Cheyenne, they were surprised to find a thoroughly modern city for the time. They met up with Adeline, and she and the baby were doing well. And so during the day, they spent a couple of days there. During the day, they would wander around Cheyenne. And they noticed in store windows that they were advertising what they call beautiful smoking jackets, silk plush black robes, and gents' elegant neckwear. Instead of, as 2 years earlier, they had been advertising in the windows buckskin underwear. So the city had come along. They had an opera house. And the most amazing thing was, that night they went to the electric works. They had electricity in Colorado City, and Mary Soper said in her diary that she felt it and saw it on her own fingers. For the first time in her life, she saw electric lights. And it was just really weird and amazing because the whole town was lit up with electric lights. And they were just amazed at the beauty of this modern city out in the middle of the Wild West. But that wasn't what they come in for. So they set off and started to push on. And they would go cross country, but occasionally it was very beautiful. And they would come to, there would be lush water in some of the rivers and a few lakes. But most of the land was pretty barren, pretty dry. There was grass everywhere, but very few trees, and just wide open spaces. They were, of course, looking for farmland. And so she would describe, well, this would be good for farming, except it didn't have enough water. And this place might be really good to have water, but it was too far from markets to be able to, take the produce. So they would push on. Next major place they came to was Fort Laramie, and it was a stark contrast to Cheyenne. This was a military post. This time the Indian Wars were still going on. It had not quite gotten to the point where the peace had been established. And so there were still huge garrisons. There were 500 soldiers there, and these were real soldiers, and it was a rough and dirty place. Now, during this whole trip, this was a group consisting of 3 women and 1 young man. And during all this time, they encountered maybe 2 other women. So if you imagine when they would come into a fort with 500 soldiers, they were pretty popular. So Mary got to talk to all these people, and she gained a lot of interesting information about the country and what was going on. They camped a little bit further north of Fort Laramie, where the Laramie River flows in the North Platte. And she described that she saw one of the most beautiful sunsets, something she would remember all her life, with the sunset reflected in the water. Of course, it was lush and green, with trees around the river there. And they had this beautiful camp there. They continued on, and after another 5 days, they came to a place called Indian Creek. And that was early in the day, but they were kind of forced to stop there because they were told there would be no more water for the next 20 miles. What water that was there, she described as looking like milkweed. But they had to settle for it and stop in that location. They camped overnight there and moved a little bit further north, where they encountered outfitted cowboys that were, herding some horses off to a horse ranch. And these cowboys guided them along the way for a little ways further, because some of the way they were going along the stage trails, but a lot of the time they were going across the country because, of course, they were searching for farmland. After the Forest Service came along, they camped in a nice spot along the river, and by the next morning they found themselves surrounded by 7,000 cattle, 100 horses, and about 30 cowboys. They were in the middle of a cattle drive. All of a sudden. And here they were introduced to the first Indians that you had ever seen. And I think Mary was feeling a little lonely at the time because one of the Indians, his name was Redbird, and he was the son of a chief named Two Moons. But she described Redbird as young, athletic, and really handsome, a splendid specimen of manhood dressed like a white man. One of the other Indians was in pink, another wore Indian garb, looked very fierce. But of course, there was no danger here with all these cowboys around to protect them. But they were a little bit intimidated because nearby was the grave of 3 white men that had been killed the year before by Indians. Across the river, they could see the above ground burial ground of an Indian squaw. And they would have been a little further up the road, they passed the graves of several men that had been killed by highwaymen that would roam the area in great numbers to rob the gold wagons that were taking gold back and forth from the hills. So they're out in this dangerous area. Again, still they pushed on, looking for farmland. Again, they furnished farmland, but it was only suited for cattle raising, and they didn't have any money to invest in cattle, so they had to continue. Finally, they reached French Creek in South Dakota in the Black Hills. It was a beautiful area. They had lots of water. The hills were nearby, so they could get lumber for heating, lumber for building their homes. And it wasn't too far to Rapid City, where there would be a good market for the farm crops. So in 1803, after traveling 300 miles in a little over 2 weeks, Silvers settled in French Creek, and it was only the 3rd family to settle in that area, which eventually became the town of Kerry in South Dakota.